I was recently writing some Dust tests in Laravel, and I ran into a situation where I wanted to test my application in essentially two different states. And these states were influenced by a config within my application. To elaborate on what I mean, I've set up a bare bones example. I'm looking at my app config file, and you can see I've got this config called open enrollment, which is currently set to true. And then in the browser, I've set it up on my homepage so that if that config is true, we see a link to enroll in this hypothetical e-learning application. Whereas if I toggle that to false, and we go back to the homepage, you can see it changes it and it says enrollments are closed. All right, very simple code here. If we look at the view, basically we're looking at that config. If it's set to true, we're going to output the link. Otherwise, we're going to output this message. So like I said, a very bare bones example, but it captures the essence of what I was facing, which is I wanted to be able to test my application in these different states that were influenced by a config. Now, my first instinct to do this, going over to my test, was to just invoke Laravel's config helper and set the config as part of my test. So for example, we could say we want, in this case, we're testing when enrollment's open. So we're going to access our config. And in this case, we're going to set it to true. And then you can see we have our browser instance that goes for the home page and then asserts that we're seeing the content we're expecting for when enrollments are open. All right, then on the flip side, here's our test for when enrollments are closed. So we would do something similar, but this time we're going to toggle it to false. All right, that seems logical. The problem is this is not going to work as expected. And just to show this, let me go run my test quick. And there we can see it's failing. Specifically, the open enrollment test is the one that's failing. The enrollment closed, that is not failing. That is passing. The reason for that is because if we go back to our app configs as they're currently set, we can see that open enrollment is in fact set to false. So logically, this scenario is working as expected. But this one here, where we're supposed to be changing that to true and then seeing this content, that is not happening. It's not actually changing the config for us. To understand why that is, we have to understand that when we're dealing with testing like this, there's really two instances of our application that are being run. The first instance is the context of the test itself. Right, so when we go to our console and we invoke PHP Artisan Dusk, that creates an instance of our application for all of our testing. And that's where this config is actually being invoked. Now, the second instance is going to be the runtime of the test itself, which is happening via our automated browser. Right? That's a completely separate instance, and this code that we're trying to invoke in our testing context is not being applied in that instance, and that's why we're not seeing the config change there. So to address this, we need to figure out some way to change our config within this browser testing environment. And a clever way to do that is using this external package called duskapiconf. What this package will do is it'll set up some routes on your application that when you hit those routes and you pass it along some config data, it will alter the configs of your application. And the idea is when you're testing, you're going to invoke some methods within this package that will go to those routes as part of the entire testing process to change those configs for you. This will make a little more sense when we see it set up. So let's dig into this. I'm going to scroll down in the README and find the installation instructions. We're just going to run composer require and pull in this package. Next, to use this package, we need to add a use line to the top of our Dusk test case file. You'll find this in your test directory. Now they do have a typo in this line. The first instance of config here should just be conf. So get rid of that IG. I did submit a pull request, so maybe by the time you look at their documentation, it might be updated. But if not, just be aware of that. All right, so with that use statement at the top, the other thing we have to do is specify that we're going to be using the trait that it's giving us access to within this class. So we'll paste that into our class and we don't have to make any modifications to that. So with that all set up, let's go back to our test. And the way we're going to use that package is we're going to access it via this class instance. We're going to have access to a method called setConfig. And the first parameter is going to be the name of the config we want to set. So in my example, that's going to be my app open enrollment. And then the second parameter we're going to pass it is what we want to set it to. In this case, I want to set it to true. All right, and then we're going to do the same thing down here for our testing when enrollment is closed. We're just going to toggle it to false. All right, let's try to run our Dust tests again. And perfect, you can see both tests are now passing. So it's as simple as that, but just to appreciate what this package is doing, I'm going to go to my Dust test case, and just for a second, I'm going to comment out the headless line. This is going to make it so I'm actually going to see the testing browser as it's running, because I want to observe the step where it's actually changing the config for us. So let me run my test again. And of course, that's going to happen so quickly that we can't see it, but because this is a video, I'm going to rewind it right now and show that essentially in slow motion so we can look at each step of this test. All right, so here's the initial screen where our tests are starting up. And then the first thing that happens is it goes to the Dusk API config route. It's going to invoke the set method. You can see this is the config we gave it, and then the value, in this case, this is just a hash version of true. Right, so when it goes to this route behind the scenes, the code within this package is going to change our open enrollment config for us to true, so that if I go to the next screen now, we can see now we get to the essence of our test where we go to the home page, and of course we're looking for that enrollment link. All right, so just rewinding, this step right here is what we're getting from this package, and that happens in our tests when we do something like invoking this set config method. So hopefully that gives you some insight into how this package is working behind the scenes. And one last thing we want to do just to wrap things up is anytime we're changing our configs like this, it's a good idea afterwards to reset them. So the way we can do that is the package comes with a method called resetConfig. So I'm just going to make sure I invoke that in both cases down here. All right, and that just makes it so that any setting changes I'm doing are isolated to this test. It's not going to influence any of my other tests. When we're resetting our configs here, it's going to default back to whatever the configs are set, whether it be in our application's config files or if it's coming from an environment file, whatever it's set to there. All right, so with that in place, let's give our test one last run just to make sure we're in a good state. And it looks like we're all set.